Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I would like to talk about this camera right here. It's the Nikon D300. Now this camera has been out for quite a while now, but it's been a camera that still produces quite nice results in my opinion, and especially for its price point at around 100 euros, I find that you can't really go wrong with this camera, and it's still quite reliable. It is weather sealed and it's actually quite nicely built. So in this video I'll be covering just pretty much my opinions on this camera. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Nikon D300, now this camera, as I mentioned earlier, it actually came out quite a long time ago. It doesn't really have a lot of features to boast about. It only has like 12 effective megapixels, and it only shoots like maximum 6 frames per second. But I think that with the pretty much decent autofocusing system and also still a very good image sensor inside, and the fact that it's very photo-centric camera, I think it's still a very nice photography camera to use. So in this video I'll be dividing it into 3 different sections. So the first section I'll be talking about the operational side of things, the ergonomics, how this camera feels, how it operates, things like that, and then I'll be talking about the image quality and then pretty much leading into the conclusion. So let's first start with the ergonomics and the operational side of things. I really love the ergonomics of this camera personally, because I really find that the camera is very comfortable to use. It's really well built, it's magnesium alloy, it is weather sealed, and the grip here is actually really nice and deep. Unlike the, let's say the D600 or the D600 line of cameras, the grip are kind of shallow despite having a really thick body, so I always find it a little bit weird. It's comfortable, but kind of a bit weird, not really a fully grip to really grip on, if that makes sense. But yeah, I also like how big the LCD screen up here is. It's quite informative as well, and the light does actually light up a little bit. My room is a little bit bright right now, but yeah, the light is there, it's green, so it's quite nice, and you can always see it in direct sunlight, of course. But the screen itself is quite viewable in direct sunlight if you're going through the menus and so on. But where it becomes not so viewable is when you're reviewing images, because the color accuracy on this screen is actually not so great. Of course, you still can judge your basic exposure, your basic composition, but just don't rely too much on the color accuracy on this screen, simply because, well, it's old, and also it's not as bright as, let's say, even the cameras from the past 5 or 6 years. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Otherwise, the buttons, the layout, I really love it. I love the button layout and everything here much more than the D600 line of cameras, because I find that it's much more logically arranged here, and if you want to change something, it's pretty much at your fingertips. The ISO button is actually correctly in place on top, and yeah, this also comes with a nice pop-up flash, which is actually really cool. Yeah, it's a very simple photography centric camera with really good buttons and not really much to complain about. Oh, and I really love one thing about this camera is that I love cameras with its own lever for the card slot. And talking about the card slot, a lot of people might find this kind of annoying, is that it only has one CF card slot, whereas some people might prefer dual card slots or even one SD card slot, things like that. I personally prefer CF card slots simply because I find that CF cards actually corrupt it less and is actually more reliable than SD cards, at least in my opinion. But yeah, that's just based on my opinion. The one downside about this camera though is the D-pad. I find that Nikon's older generation cameras, their D-pad are quite annoying. With the newer cameras, their D-pad has an OK in the middle, which is cool for pressing OK, but I find that with the older generation of Nikon DSLRs, without the OK button, like as a separate button in the middle of the D-pad, it's just so much more cumbersome to really press OK sometimes. Of course, in most of the menu, you just have to press the right button for OK, but sometimes it does require the center button as well, and you can just accidentally press on other options as well. So yeah, that can be annoying. Otherwise, yeah, the dials are really nice and the buttons are very tactile, so there's not much to complain. And the next point I would like to actually talk about is the viewfinder. The viewfinder on here is kind of okay. It's not the biggest, not the brightest, not the most accurate, but it will actually get the job done. It actually covers for the most part, and Yeah, if there's a bright sunlight shining when you're actually shooting, you will still be able to judge your scenes and everything, so I guess that's good. But yeah, the overlays and everything inside is actually not distracting despite being a small viewfinder, which is a plus in my opinion, because you still will be able to compose your image like undisturbed for the most part. And talking about the viewfinder, the AF point inside is also quite nice and responsive in my opinion. Of course, it's not like the fastest AF speed out there. It's nowhere close to your phones or even the more modern mirrorless cameras, but it will get the job done. And for the most part, if you don't use such bright lenses, then it will also be very accurate for the most part as well. The maximum shutter speed on this camera goes up to 0.008 of a second. So if you do use bright lenses, it will most likely be able to handle bright daylight as well. Unlike the D600 where it's only like up to 0.004 of a second. So if you use like f1.4, f1.2, those lenses could be way too bright to operate during daylight. So at least that's a very nice thing on this camera to consider. So yeah, and now onto the image quality. There's not really much to say about the image quality part, simply because, well, straight off of the camera, it's quite nice. The color can be a little bit dull if you're used to a lot of the smartphone nowadays and everything, but I think that the color is kind of unique. It is not so super contrasty, it's a little bit matte. Of course, cameras from that time period tends to use film as a standard to match their digital colors too, because, you know, at the time they're still trying to win trust from professional photographers to switch from film over to digital. And yeah, that's why the color of the sensors at that time, actually from a lot of manufacturers, whether it's Pentax, Canon, Nikon, a lot of their sensors tend to produce more matte color, but that also means that there's also kind of unique colors that you see from those digital sensors that you don't really see now, and also they have their own character to it. And I find that this camera, if you want to experiment, it's actually a very nice experimental camera as well, both for digital and also just, yeah, experimenting your own aesthetics with the cheaper cameras, yet reliable of course. And the color rendition on this camera is still quite nice. The skin tone is also quite nice as well. It renders it quite soft but also really detailed, if that makes sense. So if you see like any complex color patterns, this camera will still render those patterns really nicely and naturally, and it will also render into the highlights and shadows quite naturally as well. So yeah, there's that. The dynamic range on here, well, it's a pretty old camera, so it doesn't have a very high dynamic range. That said, you still can work with this camera, and for general photography, this camera is still a very nice camera because the color science is actually good enough, the skin tone is really good, and also just the way it delivers its images, it's still good enough. The raw files you still can tweak quite a bit if you want to. Just keep in mind, just like with any other older cameras, if you recover a lot of shadows, actually too much shadows, then there will be a lot of noise in the image, and I would not recommend using ISO above 1600. Even for traveling or personal work. Now, of course, I only have used this camera for personal work, nothing professionally related. That said, I still know what a clean image is, but yeah, just a little warning, don't use higher ISO than 1600 unless if you really have to. Simply because it's just so much easier to get a noisy image that way, and the image will become actually more flat. So yeah, just keep it below 1600. Otherwise, the image quality on this camera is really nice. And now over to the conclusion. Well, this camera, there's not really a lot of negative things to say about this camera, especially for its price point. The battery life is good, the AF is pretty good for general photography, even street photography, or even like moving portrait photography, but of course subtly moving. And yeah, I can't really complain much about it, and that's why I really love using it, I guess. Like, the ergonomics is great, it's weather sealed, it's really nice and tough camera. You can see the scratch, like that it's actually made out of magnesium alloy. So yeah, the color, the paint job is gone. There's flash should you ever need to use it. Oh, and also with the flash, it's actually raised quite high. So technically, if you're using flash, there's a much less chance of getting that red eye if you're shooting portrait with the flash at night, so that's a nice thing. So if there's a less chance of getting that red eye, it's also like, you know, less chance of actually always putting that hard work into editing later in post, which most people, including me, would hate. But otherwise, yeah, it's a very nice camera to use that still produces really nice images. The grip is great. Even though the battery life lasts for a long time, I find that the last 30 to 40% of the battery life tends to be out very fast. So if you do use it all the way, like, you know, 60% of the battery life, then the last 40 or 30% remaining, you might want to consider carrying a second battery with you. But otherwise, not much nitpicking is to be made. Of course, the LCD is very old and the screen doesn't articulate, but that means that when you do get to like lower angles, things like that, you might have to also kneel down with the camera, whereas with, you know, with more modern cameras with articulating screens, you can just put the camera on the tripod or just put it on the ground and just flip the screen and you will still see what the camera sees. So it's a little bit cumbersome, but not like nothing that you can't really overcome. That said, because it is a simple camera yet very reliable, it's just a very nice camera to always have with you that you can trust that it will actually hold up in a lot of conditions, because I took it through rains, through different heat waves as well, and it's still surviving. It's been dropped before and it's been banged here and there, and it's still surviving. So it's just pretty much a testament to how rugged, how well built this camera is. And the shutter actuation when I first got it is already at around 130,000 shutter life cycle. So it's just, yeah, it's still going very strong. And I also like the shutter sound. Let me actually show you the shutter sound. Oh, right, my shutter is here. Yeah, that's the shutter sound. It's actually quite nice. And with more modern mirrorless cameras, you just really miss that mechanical, heavy shutter sound. Of course, it's not super loud, but people will definitely notice. So yeah, if you're really into older cameras, or if you just really are a beginner and looking for a really reliable camera that still produces great image results, yet still allow you to learn all the manual settings, then this camera is the way to go. And being a photocentric camera, and yeah, just everything ends down to just pure photo camera. It also means that you can actually focus more on the moment, more on the stories, more on the scenarios and the storytelling side of things. So yeah, you don't need to be like thinking too much about the technicality of the camera. And that's a very wonderful thing about having just a plain simple photography camera to use every now and then. And even if you're like a professional who uses like the R5, R6 like me, using something like a stripped down as the D300 can actually be beneficial, because it actually refreshes your mind, because then you're just not really considering about, oh, I'm using this feature to get that, I'm using this particular feature to get that type of image. You just want to capture the image, and just, you know, comes down to the three, like the triangle photography points: the exposure, the ISO, and the aperture. Well, shutter, ISO, and the aperture. And yeah, just capture the moment and just actually be with the moment. So it actually can be very refreshing to your mind to just use such a simple camera like this one. And as I'm actually talking way too much than I originally intended to, let me just end here. Thank you very much for watching. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free on my website. The link is down in the description section below. Just click and download. It's absolutely for free. No need to send me your email address or anything, and I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense. If you have any questions, feel free to just leave them in the comment section below, or just contribute to anything in case it might help the community. So yeah, thank you again very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.